their property and were thus able to grow into the multi-billion-dollar corporations that they are today. But there again, it's not your average working stiff who's going to be left destitute because he's being punished for a crime that he never committed. It's corporations that amassed huge fortunes off the backs of blacks that are going to be made to share some of their ill-gotten gains. And I tell whites that different from what we hear too, reparations is a well-established principle in international law, which the U.S. has supported over and over again. This government was pivotal, and rightly so, in the Jews obtaining reparations from Germany for their Holocaust, and it backs reparations to the victims of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. The U.S. government also awarded well-deserved reparations to Japanese Americans for this country's inhumane detention of them during World War II. And with both the Jews and Japanese Americans, reparations included provisions for the descendants of the people harmed, not just for the actual victims. In general, I try to have white people compare how they feel about African Americans receiving reparations with how they feel about others who have gotten them. Do they object to the fact that their tax dollars were used to pay Japanese Americans for something that our government did before many of them were born? When I'm talking to a college audience, none of them would even come close to being born back then. And also to contribute to the building of Jewish Holocaust Museum in our nation's capital, which commemorates a hideous slaughter that they themselves had no hand in. And since I hear questions like, well, if we were to give blacks reparations, how do we know they wouldn't just squander it all and come back asking for more? I ask, would they have thought to ask such a question of the Japanese Americans or the Jews? The answer, of course, is no. I try to have people see that all of a sudden a more racist standard kicks in when something has to do with people of African ancestry, including when it comes to reparations. I also ask people to be courageous and try to see whether their objection to reparations is really about the thing itself or about the fact that it's African Americans calling for it. I suggest they experiment mentally, change the scenario, and see if it alters how they feel. For instance, what if it had been people from the continent of Europe who had been enslaved, and people of African descent who had been the slave owners and masters? Would they still be against reparations? And the biggest question is, suppose it had been their ancestors who'd undergone chattel slavery. Would they see it differently? Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the most frequently asked questions and how I answer them. As you can probably guess, you could probably all say it with me. One of the most commonly asked questions I get from white people is, my family didn't own slaves, so why should I have to pay? I tell them a person didn't have to own enslaved Africans to benefit from slavery. The entire early American economy, in the North as well as the South, was fueled by the products and revenues generated by the institution of slavery. As, for example, the government raked in millions of dollars in taxes on cotton alone, all whites, whether they were rich or poor, slaveholder or passionate abolitionist even, benefited from slavery because the whole infrastructure of this nation was built on money made from it, directly or indirectly. Every large metropolitan area in the country benefited greatly from slavery. Take New York City. From the beginning, every white person in New York benefited because slavery was a publicly organized and operated institution created by the laws of the colony of New Amsterdam. The first enslaved Africans brought to New York in 1625 weren't brought as private slaves to work for individuals, but were publicly owned by the city. They built forts, constructed houses, in general were the labor force that created the foundation of New York City as we know it today. From the founding of the Republic through the years leading up to the Civil War, New York City, as the financial and commercial capital of the U.S., controlled the sale of the slave-produced goods that were sold abroad. Cotton grown by enslaved Africans was shipped up to New York from the South and from there sold to Europe. Because of the city's economic dependence on slavery and the slave trade, now get ready for this, when South Carolina seceded from the Union in 1861, Mayor Fernando Wood proposed that New York City also secede and join the Confederacy because he thought the city would go under if it couldn't traffic in slave-produced products. Fortunately, the city council didn't go along with this proposition. Another thing I hear all the time is, I don't see why I should have to pay because my ancestors weren't here during slavery. In fact, I hear this so often, I'd almost think that there weren't any white people here during slavery. And then there's also the variation, which is a valid question. What about all the poor people who immigrated here long after slavery? Isn't it unfair to expect them to pay? First of all, it really doesn't matter when your family came over. As soon as a person's feet land on the soil, in one way or another, they too begin to benefit from what slavery created that has come down to all of us through the centuries. And the fact is, the whole reason people come to this nation in the first place is to get in on the wealth that had its origin in slavery. They don't know it, but these streets paved in gold that they came here to find could more aptly be called the streets bathed in the blood, sweat, and tears of enslaved Africans. A person simply cannot expect to come and share in what really amounts to ill-gotten gains without also having to be a part of the government making amends for the unjust way that it was amassed in the first place. Another question that perfectly well-intentioned people put to me are, it happened so long ago and all the slaves are dead, so isn't it just divisive to keep bringing it up? Wouldn't it help more to bring about racial harmony if we just buried it with the past? My response is that the ravages of slavery, both economic and spiritual, are very alive and immediate today. Persons of African ancestry are still seen and dealt with in a way that is very far from what they deserve, while we European Americans continue to receive a subtle and not so subtle white privilege in every area of life. In this country, all other ethnicities and immigrants are more respected as human beings than the descendants of slavery. And the fact is, you can't brutalize a people massively and then just tell them, get over it. That will never work, just as it would never work in our personal lives. What if I were to tell you, and fortunately this is not true, but just suppose for a moment that it were, that I was a battered wife who'd had my arm broken and my jaw wired several times. Once when my husband was beating me up and I called the police, that resulted in our children being taken away, and even now it's going to be years before I finish paying off my legal and medical bills. But now my former husband, who doesn't even think he owes me so much as an apology, wants me to let bygones be bygones and let's be friends. He says it's very unchristian of me to hold a grudge. Would you think that my ex-husband was right? People say no, definitely not. In fact, people usually laugh at the very idea. It's no different in this case. I am quite certain that there will never be healing between blacks and whites in this country until whites face up to the crime that we as a people committed against people of African descent. And begin to set it right. That's the only way that blacks will ever be able to genuinely respect us. And odd as it may seem, it's the only way we will ever be able to respect them, because no one can feel clean, at ease with, and respectful of someone that they've robbed and brutalized and then felt they got away with it. Working towards mutual respect is the only way to bring about true racial harmony. Anything else is divisive. The final question that I'm going to mention now that whites often ask me is, how will we know how to spend the money and who to give the reparations to? I tell them the good news is we white people don't have to decide anything about how descendants of slavery, how you will make your case, what you'll ask for, how you'll spend the money, and who will get reparations. All of those things are strictly up to African Americans. Just as in any other situation where one party has been injured by another and is seeking redress, it isn't the place of the party who committed the injury to tell the injured party what to do. For example, in a class action suit against the corporation, it would seem ludicrous to even suggest that the corporation should tell the people bringing charges against them how to argue their case or what they should do with it, how they should allot the money if they win. It's really just none of our business what African Americans do with the money. The only thing that is our business is looking honestly at this question. Did we as a nation commit a crime against people of African ancestry for which our government owes reparations? That's all. If we're not trying to answer that question, everything else is just an evasion. To close, I just want to say that I believe that any injustice, personal or international, which has been committed against anyone, must be seen for what it is and regretted. It cannot be lied about, smoothed over, or swept under the rug as though it's no longer important, whether it happened 3 days ago, 3 years ago, or 3 centuries ago. If it was wrong, it is wrong, and it still must be looked at honestly and sincerely revoked. That's the only way that we will ever put an end to the brutal and insidious institutionalized racism, the aftermath of slavery, that continues to plague this nation even now in the 21st century. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Donna Lamb, Caucasians United for Reparations and Equality.